So you're telling me that the same people who are supposed to protect workers' rights spent decades running the most sophisticated criminal enterprise in American labor history? Yeah, we need to talk about that. Look, I get it. When you hear labor union, you probably think of picket lines, collective bargaining, and workers fighting for their lunch breaks. Noble stuff, right? But the Teamsters Union? Oh, honey, they weren't just fighting for coffee breaks. They were breaking kneecaps, rigging elections, and casually having lunch with little mob bosses like it was a networking event. And the wildest part? This wasn't some underground operation. This was happening in broad daylight with pension funds, in offices with secretaries and everything. Today, we're diving deep into the absolute chaos that was, and in some cases, still is, corruption within the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. We're talking about a union with 1.3 million members that got so cozy with organized crime that the federal government had to babysit them for nearly 3 decades. We're talking stolen pension funds, rigged elections, mysterious disappearances. Yeah, that disappearance. An investigation so massive they make your Netflix true crime obsession look like amateur hour. Buckle up, because this rabbit hole goes deeper than Jimmy Hoffa's alleged final resting place. Too soon? Probably. Do I care? Absolutely not. Let's get into it. Here's what they don't teach you in your high school civics class. The Teamsters Union and organized crime weren't enemies. They weren't even frenemies. They were basically business partners from day one. We're talking relationships so intertwined that trying to separate them would be like trying to unscramble an egg. Good luck with that. The Teamsters formed in 1903, and by the 1930s, they'd already figured out that controlling transportation meant controlling everything. Think about it. Trucks move literally everything in America. Food, clothes, medicine, your impulse Amazon purchases at 2 a.m., all of it. If the trucks stop, the country stops. That's power. Raw, unfiltered, incredibly valuable power. The mob saw this and went, yeah, we'll take some of that. Thank you very much. And the Teamsters leadership? They didn't exactly put up a fight. Why would they? The mob offered muscle, intimidation tactics, and the kind of negotiating strategies that made sure employers signed contracts real quick. In return, the Teamsters offered access to pension funds, billions of dollars just sitting there like an all-you-can-steal buffet, and political influence that could make or break politicians. By the 1950s, this relationship was so established that congressional investigators found that Teamster locals in cities like New York, Chicago, Detroit, and Philadelphia were basically controlled by La Cosa Nostra families. Not influenced, not connected, controlled. We're talking about organized crime figures literally holding union positions, directing where pension money went, and deciding who got to work and who got to, well, not work, and sometimes not breathe, if we're being honest about it. The Teamsters Central States Pension Fund became particularly infamous. This fund was supposed to secure retirement for hard-working truck drivers. Instead, it became the bank of mob, financing everything from Las Vegas casinos to legitimate businesses that the mob wanted to own but couldn't buy outright because of that whole being criminals thing. The fund loaned out over $1.4 billion between the 1950s and 1980s, and a suspicious amount of those loans went to mob-connected enterprises. Shockingly, many of these loans were never repaid. I know, I'm as surprised as you are. Just kidding, literally nobody is surprised. But here's where it gets really spicy. Because all that pension fund money and mob control, that was just the appetizer. The main course involves a man who became so synonymous with union corruption that his name is still a punchline today, and his disappearance is still the greatest unsolved mystery in American labor history. Let's talk about James Riddle Hoffa, a man whose middle name was literally Riddle, which in retrospect feels like a universe giving us a massive hint about how his story would end. Hoffa became Teamsters president in 1957, and calling him controversial is like calling the ocean damp. Technically accurate, but wildly understating things. This man turned union leadership into an art form of corruption so brazen that he ended up on the cover of magazines, testified before Congress multiple times, and had his own Justice Department investigation team. That's right, an entire team of federal investigators whose whole job was just watching one guy. Robert Kennedy literally created a special unit called the Get Hoffa Squad. Not the Investigate Hoffa squad or the Monitor Hoffa squad. Get Hoffa. Subtle, Bobby. Real subtle. Here's what made Hoffa special. He was actually good at his job. Like, genuinely effective at winning contracts and benefits for Teamsters members. Wages went up, benefits improved, and membership exploded under his leadership. The rank and file loved him because he delivered results. The problem, and it's a pretty big problem, was that he delivered those results by being absolutely buddy-buddy with the mob and using the Teamsters like his personal piggy bank. Hoffa's connections to organized crime weren't subtle. He regularly met with mob bosses, used mob enforcers to intimidate rivals, and funneled pension fund money to mob enterprises. In 1964, he was convicted of jury tampering and fraud. Yes, jury tampering. This man tried to bribe a jury during his own trial for corruption. The audacity is almost impressive if it wasn't, completely illegal. He went to federal prison in 1967, but here's the kicker. He didn't even resign as Teamsters president. He ran the union from a federal penitentiary for 4 years. Just picture that. Sorry, can't make the board meeting. I'm in prison for corruption, but here's my agenda anyway. The absolute nerve. President Nixon commuted his sentence in 1971, but with a catch. Hoffa couldn't hold union office until 1980. Hoffa, being Hoffa, immediately started trying to wiggle around that restriction because the man did not know how to take an L. He was planning a comeback, trying to regain control of the Teamsters, and making a lot of powerful people very nervous in the process. Then, on July 30th, 1975, Jimmy Hoffa went to a meeting at the Machus Red Fox restaurant in suburban Detroit and was never seen again. Poof, gone, vanished into thin air like a magic trick. Except the magician was probably a hitman, and the trick was murder. The investigation into his disappearance has lasted nearly 50 years, cost millions of dollars, and involved digging up everything from horse farms to football stadiums to suburban driveways. They found exactly 0 Hoffas. Not a body, not a bone, not even a definitive explanation of what happened. Though, let's be real, everyone knows what happened. The mob made him disappear. The only mystery is where they put him afterward. Now, you'd think that having your president murdered and vanished would maybe prompt some organizational soul-searching, right? Hey, maybe we should clean house energy? Yeah, no. The Teamsters looked at Hoffa's disappearance and went, well, that's unfortunate. And then immediately elected more mob-connected leadership because apparently they hadn't learned a single lesson. After decades of watching the Teamsters operate like a criminal enterprise with good health benefits, the federal government finally said, okay, enough. And in 1988, they did something unprecedented in American labor history. They filed a civil RICO lawsuit against the entire union. RICO, for those who don't spend their free time reading about federal statutes like a normal person, stands for Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. It was designed to go after the mob, and the government used it against the labor union. Let that sink in for a second. The feds looked at the Teamsters and went, you're not a union with a crime problem. You're a criminal organization with a union problem. The lawsuit alleged that the Teamsters had been controlled by La Cosa Nostra since the 1950s, and that organized crime figures had infiltrated every level of union leadership. The evidence was overwhelming. We're talking wiretaps, informant testimony, financial records showing pension fund money going straight to mob operations, the whole 9 yards. In 1989, rather than fight out in court and definitely lose, the Teamsters agreed to a consent decree. This wasn't a slap on the wrist. This was the legal equivalent of your parents taking away your car, your phone, your door, and installing cameras in your room. The federal government installed a 3-member board, the Independent Review Board, to oversee the union's operations and root out corruption. They also appointed an election officer to ensure fair elections and an investigations officer to dig into all the shady dealings. This federal supervision wasn't temporary. It lasted from 1989 until 2020. That's 31 years. 31 years of federal babysitting, because the Teamsters couldn't be trusted to run themselves without stealing everything not nailed down and possibly murdering people who asked too many questions. During those 3 decades of oversight, the Independent Review Board didn't just sit around filing paperwork. They went scorched earth. They investigated over 1,500 union officials and members for corruption. They permanently barred hundreds of people from ever holding Teamster positions again. They exposed pension fund schemes, embezzlement operations, and no-show jobs, positions where mob associates got paychecks for literally not showing up to work. One guy was on the payroll for 15 years and never worked a single day, living the dream, honestly, except for the whole federal investigation thing. The IRB's investigations led to criminal prosecutions that sent dozens of union officials to prison. They dismantled entire local unions that were too corrupt to save, placing them under trusteeships and completely restructuring their leadership. It was like labor union chemotherapy, aggressive, painful, but necessary to kill the cancer. But even with federal agents basically living in the Teamsters headquarters, corruption didn't just magically disappear. Because when you spend decades building a culture of grift, embezzlement, and casual felonies, it takes more than a consent decree to change that. Some locals got the message. Others? Well, they got creative. Let's talk about Teamsters Local 560 in New Jersey, which was so spectacularly corrupt that it became the poster child for everything wrong with the union. This wasn't just a bad apple. This was an entire orchard of rotten fruit. For nearly 30 years, Local 560 was controlled by the Provenzano brothers, Anthony, Salvatore, and Nunzio. Tony Pro, as Anthony was known, was a mob captain in the Genovese crime family, who also happened to be a Teamsters vice president. Just your average dual career path. Labor organizer by day, organized crime figure, also by day because he didn't really bother hiding it. Tony Pro was directly connected to Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance. They'd had a major falling out while both were in prison together. Because nothing says friendship like being cellmates in federal prison, and Tony Pro allegedly threatened Hoffa's family. Most investigators believe Tony Pro either ordered or participated in Hoffa's murder. He was never charged with that, but he did go to prison for ordering the 1961 murder of a union rival named Anthony Castellito. Castellito's body was never found either, because apparently making bodies disappear was just standard operating procedure. Under Provenzano control, Local 560 was essentially a mob subsidiary. Union funds were embezzled. Sweetheart contracts were signed with mob-connected businesses, and anyone who objected found themselves unemployed or worse. The local had over 8,000 members, and their pension and welfare fund were treated like a personal ATM by leadership. In 1986, the federal government did something unprecedented. They filed a civil RICO suit specifically against Local 560 and won. The court removed the entire executive board and placed the local under trusteeship, not the international Teamsters, just the federal government directly. A court-appointed trustee ran the local from 1986 to 1988, completely restructuring its operations and purging corrupt officials. This was the blueprint that would eventually be applied to the entire international union. But here's the thing about blueprints. They only work if people follow them. Because while the feds were busy cleaning up the Teamsters, the mob wasn't exactly sitting around accepting defeat. They adapted. They evolved. They found new ways to get their hands into the cookie jar, and some of those methods were honestly pretty clever. Illegal, yes. Unethical, absolutely. But clever? Can't deny it. Let's get into the really nerdy stuff. The financial crimes. Because while murders and disappearances make great headlines, the real money in Teamsters corruption was always in the pension funds. And the scams they ran? Chef's kiss. Illegal chef's kiss, but still. The Central States Pension Fund, which we touched on earlier, was managing billions of dollars for Teamsters members across 22 states. That's a lot of money. An amount of money so large that it becomes abstract. Your brain can't really process billions of dollars, which is exactly what made it so easy to steal. The classic scam worked like this. A mob-connected developer or casino owner needs a loan, but can't get one from legitimate banks because of that whole organized crime situation. No problem. They go to the Teamsters Pension Fund. The fund's trustees, who are either mob-connected themselves or taking kickbacks, approve a loan at below-market interest rates with terrible repayment terms. Sometimes they don't even require collateral, which in the lending business is like giving someone your car keys and just hoping they bring it back. The borrower takes the money, builds their casino or development, and then doesn't pay it back. Shocker. The pension fund is out millions, but the trustees don't care because they got their cut. Meanwhile, the actual Teamsters members whose retirement money this is supposed to be, they're screwed. Between 1960 and 1983, the Central States Pension Fund made over $1.4 billion in loans. Investigators later determined that approximately $300 million of those loans were to mob-connected enterprises, and a huge chunk of that money was never repaid. $300 million. That's not a rounding error. That's a heist. But wait, it gets better. Some of these loans went to Las Vegas casinos, the Stardust, the Fremont, the Aladdin, Caesar's Palace. The pension fund basically financed the Las Vegas Strip. The mob controlled these casinos, skimmed money off the top before it was reported as income, and used the casinos to launder money from other illegal operations. The Teamsters Pension Fund was literally bankrolling organized crime's gambling empire. The federal government eventually forced the pension fund to sell off these casino investments at a loss, and in 1982, they mandated that independent managers take over funds' investments. But by then, hundreds of millions of dollars had vanished, and countless Teamsters members saw their retirement benefits cut because the money that was supposed to be there wasn't. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but this is all old news. The mob's not what it used to be. Surely modern Teamsters corruption is less murdery? And you'd be right. Modern corruption is far more white-collar. Less cement shoes, more embezzlement. Progress? Sort of. Here's the beautiful thing about labor union corruption. It's surprisingly democratic. It's not just the big international presidents and mob bosses getting their hands dirty. Local union officials at every level have found creative ways to steal from their members, and some of these schemes are almost adorable in their simplicity. Take Local 851 in California. In 2018, the longtime president and secretary-treasurer were convicted of embezzling over $400,000 in union funds. How'd they do it? They just took it. They used union credit cards for personal expenses, wrote themselves unauthorized checks, and created fake invoices for expenses that never happened. No elaborate scheme, no mob connections, just straightforward theft. They treated union money like their personal checking account and apparently hoped nobody would notice. Spoiler alert, people noticed. Or how about Local 705 in Chicago, where in 2020, the secretary-treasurer was charged with embezzling over $850,000. His method? Even simpler. He just wrote checks to himself and his family members. For years, just casually looting the treasury like he was at a buffet. He also used union funds to pay for his daughter's college tuition, because why should he pay for that when 5,000 union members could pay for it instead? Then there's the creative expenses. Union officials billing the union for luxury vacations and calling them conferences, buying expensive cars and claiming they're for union business. One official in Pennsylvania expensed over $50,000 in golf outings and strip club visits as member outreach. Member outreach. The creativity is honestly impressive. But my personal favorite has to be the officials who create shell companies and then have a union hire those companies for services at wildly inflated prices. It's embezzlement with extra steps. One official in New Jersey created a consulting firm that he owned, had the local hire it for $30,000 a month, and the consulting firm did absolutely nothing for 3 years. That's over $1 million for literally zero work. The problem is that many local unions have weak financial oversight. Some don't require 2 signature checks, don't have independent audits, and don't segregate financial duties. It's like leaving your front door open and being surprised when stuff goes missing. The federal supervision helped implement better financial controls at the international level, but local unions? That's been a much slower process. Of course, embezzlement is amateur hour compared to election fraud, because if you can control who gets elected, you can control everything. And the Teamsters have had more rigged elections than a corrupt small-town sheriff's race. Let's talk about Teamsters elections, which for decades were about as legitimate as a $3 bill. Before federal oversight, Teamsters elections were conducted using a delegate system at the international level. Local unions would send delegates to the international convention, and those delegates would elect the international officers. Sounds democratic, right? Wrong. So wrong. Catastrophically wrong. Here's how it actually worked. Whoever controlled the international had the power to approve or reject new local unions. So they just create new locals in areas they controlled, stuff them with loyalists, and boom, guaranteed delegates for the next election. They could also put corrupt locals under trusteeship, remove the existing leadership, install their own people, and suddenly that locals' delegates were voting the right way. Delegates were also pressured, bribed, and in some cases threatened to vote a certain way. We're not talking subtle influence. We're talking envelopes of cash, promises of union positions, and occasionally physical intimidation. One investigation found that at the 1981 convention, organized crime figures were directly involved in delivering delegate votes to their preferred candidates. The consent decree changed everything. It mandated direct elections where every Teamster member could vote for international officers. One member, one vote. Revolutionary. Also, how democracy is supposed to work. But apparently that needed to be court-ordered. The first direct election in 1991 was chaos. Ron Carey, a reform candidate from New York, won the presidency against two old guard candidates. It looked like a new era for the Teamsters. Corruption was over. Everyone learned their lesson. Yeah, not so much. In 1996, Carey ran for re-election against James P. Hoffa, yes, Jimmy Hoffa's son, because the Teamsters are nothing if not committed to their brand. Carey won by a narrow margin, but then the election officer discovered that Carey's campaign had engaged in massive fraud. They'd used union funds to finance the campaign, embezzled money from the union, and created an elaborate kickback scheme to funnel donations. The election was overturned. Carey was disqualified, barred from the union for life, and eventually indicted, though later acquitted. The Teamsters had their first democratic election in history, and it was so corrupt they had to do it over. The irony is almost poetic. Hoffa won the 1998 rerun election and would serve as Teamsters president until 2022. First James P. Hoffa, serving 5 terms, making the name Hoffa synonymous with Teamsters leadership for over 60 years total between father and son. Dynasties aren't just for monarchies, apparently. Even with direct elections, problems persisted. Allegations of ballot tampering, intimidation of reform candidates, and financial irregularities popped up in election after election. The election officer had to investigate complaints constantly. In some cases, local elections were overturned entirely because the fraud was so blatant. The 2021 international election showed that old habits die hard. There were allegations of delegate intimidation, campaign finance violations, and irregularities in ballot counting. The election went forward, but the complaints demonstrated that even after 30 years of federal oversight, some Teamsters factions still viewed elections as something to be manipulated rather than respected. But here's where it gets really interesting, because while the old-school mob infiltration has largely been dismantled, there's a new kind of corruption that's arguably more insidious because it's perfectly legal, or at least exists in a gray area where legality gets very fuzzy. Modern Teamsters corruption isn't always about stealing money or rigging elections. Sometimes it's about the cozy relationships between union leadership and the companies they're supposed to be fighting against. It's corruption in a suit and tie, happening over golf games and charity dinners. Here's a fun example. Union officials who sit on corporate boards. Now, having union representation on corporate boards can be great for workers. It gives labor a voice in management decisions. But it can also create massive conflicts of interest when those same union officials are supposed to be negotiating contracts and fighting for their members against those very same companies. In 2019, a Teamsters official in the Midwest was found to be receiving consulting fees from a trucking company whose workers he represented. He was being paid by both the union and the company. Let me repeat that. He was taking money from the company while negotiating on behalf of workers against that company. That's not a conflict of interest. That's just working for the other team while wearing your team's jersey. Then there's the issue of union officials having business relationships with employers. One investigation found officials who owned companies that did business with the same employers they negotiated contracts with. Hey, I'll go easy on you in contract negotiations if you hire my brother's trucking company. It's not quite a bribe, but it's in the same neighborhood, maybe next door, definitely close enough to wave to each other. Sweetheart contracts are another modern corruption classic. These are contracts that union leadership negotiates with employers that benefit the company more than the workers. Why would union leadership do this? Because they get something in return. Not money necessarily, but political support, favorable treatment, or benefits for themselves personally. For instance, a contract might have weak wage increases and poor health benefits, but it includes generous pension contributions for union officials specifically. Or it might include provisions that make it easier for company to operate while doing little for rank-and-file members. But the company then makes donations to the union's political action committee or helps leadership get reelected by not challenging them publicly. The Department of Labor has investigated dozens of these arrangements over the years, but they're incredibly hard to prosecute because proving quid pro quo corruption requires evidence that's tough to get. A lot of these relationships exist in handshake agreements and unspoken understandings that never make it to paper. And then there's my personal favorite category of modern union corruption, the absolutely ridiculous expenses that officials charge their members. Because apparently, when you're a union leader, living like the people you represent is more of a suggestion than a rule. Here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. The absolutely bonkers salaries and benefits that some Teamsters officials pay themselves while their members are driving trucks for a living. The Teamsters International president makes over $300,000 a year in salary and benefits. Regional officials and some local presidents make similar amounts. Now, running a union with 1.3 million members is complicated work, sure, but let's keep some perspective here. The median Teamster member makes around $45,000 to $65,000 a year, depending on their sector. But it's not just the salaries. It's everything around them. Some officials have chauffeur cars, paid for by union dues, to drive them around. Some have expense accounts that would make a corporate CEO blush. First-class flights to conferences in resort destinations. Hotels that cost more per night than their members make in a week. In 2017, an investigation into multiple Teamsters locals found officials expensing luxury watches, designer clothes, and expensive jewelry as business expenses. One official bought a $7,000 suit and expensed it as professional attire for negotiating. Brother, Teamsters members negotiate contracts in jeans and work boots. You're not fooling anyone. Multiple officials have been caught using union credit cards for personal vacations, family dinners, and entertainment that has absolutely nothing to do with union business. When caught, the excuse is usually, "I thought it was appropriate," or "I plan to pay it back." Sure you did. The Department of Labor requires unions to file annual financial disclosure forms called LM2 forms, which detail how money is spent. These are public records, and they're absolutely wild to read. You'll see line items like $25,000, Leadership Training Conference, Las Vegas, or $40,000, Officer Retreat, Hawaii. Meanwhile, there's another line item that says $1,500, Hardship Fund for members. Do the math on that. They spent nearly 30 times more on their Hawaiian retreat than they did helping struggling members. The optics are catastrophically bad, but more importantly, it's a fundamental betrayal of what a union is supposed to be about. There have been reform movements within the Teamsters focused specifically on salary transparency and expense accountability. Teamsters for a Democratic Union, TDU, a rank-and-file reform group, has been pushing for salary caps tied to what members make, mandatory expense disclosure, and elections for officials who abuse their positions. Some of these reforms have been implemented, but enforcement is inconsistent across different locals. But you know what? For all the corruption, for all the mob ties and embezzlement and ridiculous expense reports, there's one thing that makes Teamsters corruption particularly fascinating. It coexists with genuine union achievements. Like, the same union that had mob bosses running pension funds also won groundbreaking contracts and benefits for workers. It's cognitive dissonance on an institutional scale. Here's the uncomfortable truth that makes Teamsters corruption so complicated. Even at their most corrupt, they were often effective at winning benefits for their members. Under Jimmy Hoffa's leadership in the 1960s, when mob infiltration was at its peak, The Teamsters negotiated the National Master Freight Agreement, which standardized wages and benefits across the trucking industry and created some of the best-paying blue-collar jobs in America. Teamsters truck drivers in the 1960s and 70s could afford houses, cars, and middle-class lives for their families. The union delivered. This created a massive moral hazard. Members could see that their leadership was corrupt, but they were also seeing their paychecks increase and their benefits improve. So there was this implicit trade-off. We'll look the other way on the mob stuff and the embezzlement as long as you keep getting us good contracts. It's like having a financial advisor who's definitely running some shady schemes on the side, but your retirement fund keeps growing. So you don't ask too many questions. This is why reform movements within the Teamsters always struggled. It's hard to rally members against corrupt leadership when that leadership is also negotiating industry-leading contracts. Reformers would say, "Your pension fund is being looted," and members would respond, "Yeah, but I just got a $3 an hour raise and better health insurance, so..." The consent decree and federal oversight forced the Teamsters to clean up their act, but there was real concern among members that cleaning up corruption might mean losing negotiating power. There was this idea, probably not entirely wrong, that some of the Teamsters' negotiating success came from their willingness to use, shall we say, aggressive tactics that a reformed union might not be able to deploy. And here's the thing. After federal supervision ended in 2020, there's been an interesting test of this theory. Can the Teamsters be both clean and effective? The early returns are actually pretty positive. In 2023, under current General President Sean O'Brien, the Teamsters negotiated a massive contract with UPS that included significant wage increases, better working conditions, and the elimination of the two-tier wage system that had created inequality within the workforce. They won this through aggressive organizing, strike threats, and modern labor tactics, no mob muscle required. O'Brien has positioned himself as a reform leader, though critics point out that he came up through the same system and has his own controversial relationships and past decisions. The jury's still out on whether this represents real cultural change or just better PR. But here's the broader point. The Teamsters' history shows that corruption and effectiveness aren't mutually exclusive. An organization can be both deeply corrupt and genuinely beneficial to its members. That's what makes rooting out corruption so challenging. Because you're not just fighting criminals, you're fighting a system that, for many people, has actually worked despite its rot. The investigations, the consent decree, the federal oversight, all of it was necessary. But it also disrupted a system that, however compromised, was delivering for working people. The challenge of the modern Teamsters is proving that they can deliver those same results without the corruption, that they can be powerful without being criminal, that they can fight for workers without fighting like the mob. So far, the evidence is mixed. Corruption cases still pop up regularly at the local level. Financial irregularities are still investigated. But the large-scale, systematic mob infiltration, that's mostly gone. The days of the Central States Pension Fund financing Vegas casinos? Over. The days of union presidents disappearing after lunch meetings? Hopefully also over, though let's not jinx it. What remains is a union still grappling with its identity. Is it the scrappy advocate for working people, or the bloated bureaucracy with too many officials making too much money? Is it the democratic organization running fair elections, or the machine that still advantages insiders and incumbents? Is it the reformed institution that learned from federal oversight, or the barely restrained organization just waiting for the supervision to end so they can go back to old habits? The answer, frustratingly, is probably all the above depending on which local you're looking at and which day of the week it is. Okay, I said 10 facts, but we're getting a bonus because I can't leave this story without talking about what actually worked in cleaning up the Teamsters. Because for all the doom and gloom, there were real successes. The direct election system, despite the 1996 disaster, fundamentally changed the union's power dynamics. Before direct elections, an entrenched leadership could stay in power indefinitely by controlling the delegate system. Now, they actually have to answer to members. This has led to more competitive elections, more reform candidates, and more accountability. It's not perfect, but it's progress. The independent review board's work was genuinely impressive. They didn't just go after the obvious corruption. They investigated tips, followed money trails, and built comprehensive cases against union officials at every level. Between 1989 and 2020, they permanently barred over 500 individuals from union membership or positions. That's 500 corrupt officials who can never hold power in the Teamsters again. They also established financial oversight mechanisms that made it much harder to loot pension funds or embezzle union money. 2 signature requirements for large checks, mandatory independent audits, segregation of financial duties, regular financial reporting to members. These aren't exciting reforms, but they work. They're the bureaucratic equivalent of changing the locks after a burglary. The election officer position created genuinely fair election procedures. Members can file complaints knowing they'll be investigated. Candidates who face intimidation have recourse. Ballot security improved dramatically. Again, not sexy, but effective. Perhaps most importantly, the consent decree created a culture where corruption investigations were normal rather than taboo. Before federal oversight, investigating your own union leaders was seen as betrayal. You didn't rat out fellow Teamsters, even if they were stealing. The oversight period normalized accountability. It became acceptable, even expected, to question leadership, demand transparency, and report wrongdoing. The creation and empowerment of reform caucuses like Teamsters for a Democratic Union, TDU, also mattered. These groups kept pressure on leadership, ran reform candidates, published investigative reports, and gave rank-and-file members a voice. They weren't always successful, but they changed the conversation. The Department of Labor's increased scrutiny helped too. After decades of barely enforcing the Labor Management Reporting and Disclosure Act, the DOL started actually investigating union financial crimes. They brought criminal cases, imposed fines, and created real consequences for corruption. This wasn't just about the Teamsters. It sent a message to all labor unions that the days of treating union treasuries like personal piggy banks were over. But let me be clear about something. Corruption didn't disappear when federal supervision ended in 2020. It evolved. It got smarter. It got harder to detect. Modern Teamsters corruption is less about mob hits and pension fund schemes and more about financial manipulation, election irregularities, and the boring but effective embezzlement that doesn't make headlines. It's officials hiring relatives for no-show jobs. It's questionable expenses approved by complicit boards. It's sweetheart deals that benefit leadership at the expense of members. In 2021, the secretary-treasurer of a large East Coast local was indicted for embezzling over $600,000 through fake vendor schemes. In 2022, a Midwest local president was convicted of labor racketeering for taking bribes from employers in exchange for favorable contract terms. In 2023, the DOL investigated multiple locals for election violations. The corruption continues, just in different forms. The question isn't whether corruption still exists in the Teamsters. It absolutely does. The question is whether the union has the institutional will and mechanisms to keep fighting it without federal oversight forcing them to do so. Here's what the Teamster saga really represents. The eternal tension in any large organization between accountability and effectiveness, between democracy and efficiency, between serving your mission and serving yourself. The Teamsters became corrupt because the people in charge realized they could be. They had power, access to money, and insufficient oversight. That's a recipe for corruption in any organization, corporate, government, nonprofit, or union. The Teamsters weren't uniquely evil. They were uniquely positioned to get away with it for a uniquely long time. The federal intervention worked because it forced transparency and created consequences. You can't embezzle if independent auditors are checking the books. You can't rig elections if there's a federal officer monitoring the vote. You can't ignore complaints if there's a review board with subpoena power. But here's the thing about external oversight. It's not a permanent solution. Eventually, the organization has to internalize those values and mechanisms. It has to want to be clean, not just be forced to be clean. And that's the real test the Teamsters are facing now. Because ultimately, corruption is cultural. It's not just a few bad actors. It's an organizational culture that tolerates, enables, or encourages corruption. And culture is the hardest thing to change. For decades, the Teamsters had a culture where corruption was normal, where loyalty meant not asking questions, where getting ahead meant playing along with shady dealings, where the mob was just part of how business got done. That culture didn't develop overnight, and it won't disappear overnight either. Changing culture requires new leadership, which the Teamsters have had multiple times. But it also requires new members who never experienced the old culture and refuse to tolerate it. It requires transparency becoming so ingrained that secrecy feels wrong. It requires accountability becoming so expected that corruption feels risky rather than rewarding. The Teamsters are in the middle of this cultural transition. Some locals have genuinely reformed, with transparent finances, democratic practices, and leadership that serves members rather than themselves. Other locals are still operating with old-school mentality, just being more careful about how they do it. The Teamster story isn't just about one union. It's a cautionary tale for the entire labor movement. Because here's the uncomfortable reality. Every large organization with money and power is vulnerable to corruption, unions included. The labor movement is experiencing a resurgence in America right now. Union approval ratings are at their highest in decades. Organizing is up. High-profile strikes are winning major victories. This is all good news for workers. But it also means more money, more power, and more opportunities for corruption if unions aren't careful. The Teamsters experience shows what happens when unions lose sight of their mission. When leaders start seeing the union as a vehicle for personal gain rather than worker advocacy. When power becomes an end in itself rather than a means to improving members' lives. When the organization becomes more important than the people it serves. Other unions have watched the Teamsters saga and hopefully learned lessons. Many have implemented stronger financial controls, more democratic procedures, and better accountability mechanisms. But vigilance is eternal. Corruption is always looking for the next opportunity. Here's the beautiful irony of the whole Teamsters corruption saga. The same law that was used to take down the mob, RICO, was used to clean up the union the mob had infiltrated. The government used organized crime statutes against a labor organization, which sounds dystopian until you realize the labor organization was literally run by organized crime. And the same union that fought for workers' rights while simultaneously stealing workers' pension money is now fighting for workers' rights while trying to prove they won't steal workers' pension money. Progress is weird sometimes. Jimmy Hoffa spent his life building Teamsters power, and his disappearance became the symbol of that power's corruption. His son spent 24 years as president trying to legitimize that power while carrying a name synonymous with union corruption. The current leadership is trying to write a new chapter where Teamsters means powerful advocacy without the criminality. So where are we now in 2026? The Teamsters are trying to prove they can be the union that fights like hell for workers without literally being held to work for if you're an honest official. Sean O'Brien's leadership has been aggressive and public in ways that previous presidents weren't. He's willing to call out companies publicly, threaten strikes, and mobilize members for political action. He's also maintained, so far, that this can be done cleanly without mob connections or corrupt backroom deals. But skepticism is warranted. O'Brien came up through the Boston local system, which has its own controversial history. He's made decisions that critics have questioned. And fundamentally, he's operated within a structure that was built during corrupt times and still has elements of that embedded in its DNA. The real test will be what happens when no one is watching. When there's no federal supervisor, no consent decree, no court-ordered oversight. When it's just the union, its leadership, and its members. Will the reforms hold? Will the culture truly have changed? Or will corruption creep back in? Just more carefully this time? You might be wondering why any of this matters if you're not a Teamster. Fair question. Here's why. The Teamsters represent 1.3 million workers across transportation, logistics, warehousing, and related industries. These are the people who move the stuff that makes modern life possible. When the Teamsters are strong and effective, workers in those industries have better wages, better benefits, and better working conditions. When the Teamsters are corrupt, those same workers get screwed twice, once by their employers and once by their own union. More broadly, union corruption undermines the entire labor movement. Every time a union official gets caught embezzling, every time a pension scandal hits the news, Every time there's a rigged election or a mob connection, it feeds the narrative that unions are corrupt and workers are better off without them. Corporate interests love this narrative because it helps them fight organizing efforts. The Teamsters corruption saga gave ammunition to anti-union forces for decades. Look at the Teamsters. They'd say, this is what happens with unions. Corruption, mob ties, stolen money. Never mind that corporate corruption is far more prevalent and costly. The Teamsters became the poster child for labor corruption. Cleaning up that corruption isn't just good for Teamsters members. It's good for the entire labor movement because it removes that talking point and demonstrates that unions can police themselves, maintain integrity, and serve workers effectively. What can we learn from 70-plus years of Teamsters corruption investigations? 1. Power without accountability leads to corruption. Always. The Teamsters had enormous power and minimal oversight for decades, and surprise, corruption flourished. This applies to corporations, governments, nonprofits, and yes, unions. Accountability isn't optional, it's essential. 2. Corruption is cultural, and culture is hard to change. You can remove corrupt individuals. But if the culture that enabled them remains, new corrupt individuals will rise. Real reform requires cultural transformation, which takes time, effort, and sustained pressure. 3. Effectiveness doesn't excuse corruption. The Teamsters deliver for their members, even while being corrupt, and that made members willing to overlook the corruption. But this is a dangerous trade-off. Organizations that accept corruption in exchange for results eventually find that the corruption undermines the results. Pension funds that get looted can't pay retirements. Unions that cut sweetheart deals lose bargaining power. Corruption is a cancer that eventually consumes everything. For external pressure works, but internal will matters more. The federal consent decree forced the Teamsters to clean up, and it worked. But sustainable reform requires the organization to internalize those values. External pressure can create change. Only internal commitment can sustain it. 5. Transparency is the best disinfectant. The most effective anti-corruption measures were the ones that forced disclosure. Public financial reports, election oversight, investigation procedures that members could access. Sunlight kills corruption. Secrecy feeds it. Let's not forget that behind all these statistics and scandals are real people. Teamsters members who paid union dues expecting representation and got theft. Workers whose pension benefits were cut because their fund was looted. Honest union officials who were intimidated, threatened, or driven out for trying to do the right thing. Anthony Castellito, the union official murdered in 1961 for challenging Provenzano, left behind a wife and children. His body was never found. His family never got closure. That's the human cost of corruption, not just stolen money, but destroyed lives. The truck drivers who worked their entire careers expecting a secure retirement only to discover their pension fund had been raided. Those are real people who suffered real consequences from corruption they had no power to stop. The reformers who ran for office against machine candidates and faced harassment, intimidation, and in some cases violence. Those people showed courage that's easy to overlook when we're talking about statistics and legal cases. Corruption isn't a victimless crime. It has real human costs that extend far beyond the money stolen or the laws broken. But here's the thing about the Teamsters story. It's also a story of reform, accountability, and change. It's proof that even deeply corrupt institutions can be cleaned up with sufficient pressure, oversight, and will. The consent decree worked. Federal supervision worked. The reforms implemented during that period genuinely improved the union. Corruption didn't disappear, but it was dramatically reduced. The worst abuses were stopped. The mob's control was broken. Democratic processes were established. This didn't happen by accident. It happened because federal investigators did their jobs, because prosecutors brought cases, because judges imposed consequences, because reformers within the union kept fighting even when it seemed hopeless, and because enough Teamsters members demanded better. If the Teamsters can reform, with their decades of mob infiltration and embedded corruption, then any organization can reform. It's not easy, it's not quick, and it's never finished. But it's possible. We started this journey with Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance, and it's fitting that we end there too, because Hoffa's empty grave represents everything about Teamsters corruption. The mystery, the violence, the mob connections, the unanswered questions, and the price paid for mixing labor organizer with organized crime. But maybe the real question isn't where Hoffa is buried. Maybe it's whether the Teamsters can finally bury the corruption he represented, whether they can take the power and influence he built, legitimately and illegitimately, and use it purely for the purpose unions are supposed to serve, advocating for workers. 70 years of investigations, countless prosecutions, a 31-year federal supervision, and ongoing scrutiny have brought the Teamsters to this point. They've been given the opportunity to be better. The question is whether they'll take it. So here's what I want you to do. If you're a Teamster or a union member of any kind, pay attention to your union's finances. Read those LM2 forms. Ask questions about expenses. Demand transparency. Vote in elections. Support reform candidates when they deserve support. Hold your leadership accountable. If you're not a union member, understand that labor unions, despite their flaws and despite corruption scandals like this, are one of the only mechanisms workers have to balance corporate power. The answer to union corruption isn't to eliminate unions. It's to demand better unions. And for everyone, remember that corruption flourishes in the dark and dies in the light. Whether it's unions, corporations, or government, transparency and accountability are what keep organizations honest. Demand them. Expect them. Don't settle for less. The Teamsters corruption saga is a story about what happens when we don't. Let's make sure we learn from it. Look, I could keep going. We haven't even touched on the Canadian Teamsters corruption, the UPS negotiations drama, the Amazon organizing efforts, or the internal battles happening right now in locals across the country. This topic is deeper than Jimmy Hoffa's alleged burial site, and trust me, that's saying something. But we've been here for a while, and if you've made it this far, you deserve a medal or at least a strong drink, which ironically was probably delivered by a Teamster. If you found this dive into union corruption fascinating or terrifying or both, hit that like button. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into the wild world of institutional corruption, organized crime, and the weird intersection where labor organizing meets literal mob activity. Drop a comment and let me know. Do you think the Teamsters have actually reformed, or are they just better at hiding the corruption now? Are unions essential for worker rights despite corruption risks? Or does corruption undermine their entire purpose? And most importantly, where do you think Jimmy Hoffa is buried? Wrong answers only, please. Share this video with anyone who thinks unions are boring or that corruption only happens in movies. This is real life, it's ongoing, and it's absolutely wild. I'll catch you in the next one, where we'll probably dive into another rabbit hole of institutional chaos, because apparently that's what we do here now. Until then, stay skeptical, demand accountability, and maybe don't accept any meetings at the Machus Red Fox restaurant. Just saying. Peace out.